This is StoryBeat, Storytellers on Storytelling, an exploration into how master storytellers and artists develop and build brilliant stories and works of art that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators of all kinds find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University in the heart of downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or a review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. Well, you may know my guest today, Danny Goldman, because he's been for the past 50 years in numerous highly popular movies and TV shows. You may know him as Nick Dutton from The Good Life, or as Ozzie on Mickey Spillane's Mike Hammer, or as the persistent medical student who asks Dr. Frankenstein about his father in Mel Brooks Young Frankenstein, or as Captain Murrhardt in Robert Altman's original movie of MASH. Danny has appeared on screen in dozens of roles in dozens of shows and movies, but he may be best known for his playing the voice of Brainy Smurf in the long-running animated series The Smurfs. Aside from being a working actor, Danny spent nearly 30 years as a prominent casting director of TV commercials. Back when I was designing a lot of theater lighting in Los Angeles, I had the great privilege of designing the lighting of a terrific production that Danny directed of a show called Summit Conference at the Odyssey Theater Ensemble that starred Madeline Smith, Kelly Ward, and Allie Mills. And for all those reasons and many more, it is my very great pleasure to have on StoryBeat today the one and only Danny Goldman. Danny, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that really kind introduction.
Well, it's well-deserved. You've had a heck of a career. So let's talk a little bit about your history, if we could. So how old were you when you first got bitten by the entertainment bug?
I think I was 5 or 6 years old, and my parents took me to see a production of Oklahoma. And what I noticed, we were sitting way on the side, and I noticed that the actors in the wings were one thing, and then they came on and they were cowboys and Indians and Oklahomans and whatever they were. And I thought, this is amazing. They stand outside and they suddenly come on and they're this character. And I thought, this is magic.
Mm-hmm, that's what it is.
So I think I was sort of hooked on the entertainment world right then and there. It was like, oh my God, I want that.
So you were a little boy when this happened?
I was a very little guy.
Mm-hmm.
I was a very little guy, yes.
And what would you say, aside from that, were your earliest inspirations and influences? What was your first creative love, and that made you decide to pursue this business?
I think it was the constant. My parents would take us to Broadway shows a lot because I think some of the charities that they were into would sponsor these nights at the theater, and so they took all the kids to see plays, and it was seeing these plays on Broadway that were professionally done and were incredible shows
mm-hmm.
that really stimulated me. And then, unfortunately, later when I was about 14, I was on a student ship and came down with polio, of all things.
Wow.
And so my face and my voice were completely gone to me for a while. And luckily, I was really lucky that it had no residual effect, and I was able to speak ultimately, and I was able to, my facial muscles returned. And however, so acting for a while was out of the question for me. And then when I was in college, I think I volunteered at I went to Columbia College.
In New York?
To the theater. They didn't have a theater department because Columbia at that time was so snooty, they thought a theater department would turn it into a trade school. So what they had was an extracurricular activities center, and we would produce about 2 or 3 plays a year and an annual varsity show. And I think I became the president of the Columbia Players. And there were interesting people around at that time. Brian De Palma did a play there as an actor, and he was a friend at that time. Another really wonderful actor, William Finley, who was also a Brian De Palma favorite in his early career. Bill appeared in all these Brian De Palma films, including, I think, The Phantom of the Paradise, in which I think he played the Phantom. Anyway, and he was a very good friend of mine, too, from that period at Columbia. And from the plays that we did at Columbia, whenever I would get a job as an actor, I would insist they hire my friend Bill Finley, because I thought he was 10 times more talented than I was. And very often we got to work together a lot on various plays. Anyway, from there, from Columbia, I got a job as a stage manager off-Broadway, got my equity card, and then Equity at that time had something called the Equity Library Players, and they would revive shows, and I forgot, but it was like an Equity, the Actors' Equities showcase, in a sense. And I did a French play there and got some work out of it. So
was this in New York?
Experience.
Was this in New York?
This was in New York.
In New York.
Yes, all in New York.
So this was Columbia in New York, the famous Columbia University.
Columbia College, in New York,
College.
Yes.
Got it. And who at that time were your acting heroes, aside from William Finley?
Well, there were lots of people. I loved of all people, Gene Wilder, who I didn't know at the time, and who was in a production of a play called Love that had Eli Wallach and his wife. It was a 3-character play, and it was a huge hit at the time by Murray Shizgal, I believe.
Right, Murray Shizgal.
And I was just enraptured with Gene Wilder. I was sort of fascinated by him.
Well, he's unusual.
Now, at the same time, around the same time, I was also working in an art gallery on Madison Avenue. I had all these jobs that I had to support myself. As a working actor in New York, you got so little opportunity to make a living that you had to take all these auxiliary jobs. And one of the jobs I had was in an art gallery. And very often I would run into, though I did not know him at the time, Gene Wilder, at the lunch counter at Schraft's. I think it was at 80-something Street and Madison Avenue.
Right.
And I saw him there a number of times, but I never had the guts to go over to say hello. And then we ended up working together.
This was before he was a star, yes?
Yes, and the last time I saw him, I had just seen The Producers. I was so blown away by it. But again, I didn't come over to him at the lunch counter and say, "Oh my God, I just saw this amazing movie."
And then you got to work with him in Young Frankenstein, right?
Yes. Then years later, 7, 8 years later, I got to work with him on Young Frankenstein.
Well, let's talk about that experience. What was working on Young Frankenstein like? How did you get that job in the first place? Just a standard audition or some other way?
It was a standard audition, and it was very clear that Mel Brooks liked me. And then I had the pleasure of working with him, and it was shot at USC. And the interesting thing is, on lunch hour, Mel Brooks would walk to wherever we were eating lunch, or he'd want to take a walk on the campus, and he would stop people and say, "So, what are you studying? What's your major?" He would just stop people and start asking them questions about themselves, some of whom recognized him and many that didn't.
And how did you find him as a director? Was he helpful to you?
Oh, my God, he was great. He was just great.
What did he do that was unusual?
Gene Wilder was even better. At one point, Gene Wilder came over to me, and I had the flu while we were shooting the scene. I was very sick, and he was concerned about me, and he picked up my arm and just wanted to see what my relaxation level was like from if my arm had been tense or tight, and he said, "Oh, you're fine." So that was his diagnosis.
Dr. Wilder told you what was good.
Right.
Yeah. So
he was a love. I mean, what a lovely guy, and the fact that I really liked him so much, younger when I knew him, before I knew him, it was a thrill to get to work with him, and he was a super gent, and as I'm sure everyone in the industry who ever worked with him knew that to be the case with Gene Wilder.
What can, in your estimation, if you're able to figure it out, what made him different? What was it that he did that so many actors don't do?
He has a way of committing himself that is so total. You know, I know actors walk around and they assume that they are the part or somehow, but there's something about his total commitment to whatever thing he's working on. Like if it's a comic bit, he commits so completely to it with such focus. It was sort of incredible to watch. And I've worked with a lot of other different people that were pretty amazing, but there was no one beat him for that kind of commitment to the task at hand.
Would you say it was the same with Mel Brooks, that he was utterly committed to it as well?
Oh, absolutely, yes, absolutely, yes.
And did
one time I worked with, I worked on an episode of Columbo with Peter Falk, who somehow I knew. I don't remember how I knew him, but when I came on the set, he greeted me he said, "Oh, Mr. Goldman," he called me. No, he didn't call me Mr. He said, "Goldman, how are you?" And I go on the set, and I think I was playing a photographer, and he said to me, "You know what, Goldman, go home. I hate the set." Every day for about 5 days, I'd show up at the call time. He would come out to meet me and he'd say, "Goldman, go home. I hate the script."
Wow.
He had a meticulous way of working where he would, in rehearsal or when the cameras weren't rolling, he would plot out his various moves, and he would talk himself through it, which was an interesting process to watch. So he would say, "And then I go to the desk. I look at the desk, and then I open a drawer. From the drawer, I close it angrily." And he would sort of narrate himself what his sequence was going to be in that particular scene.
Beat for beat.
I thought it was fascinating. I've never seen anybody else do that.
Well, I will tell you, I spent 6 months working with Peter Falk when I designed the lighting for 3 shows for John Cassavetes, and Falk was in one of them. And
my God, I didn't know this.
Yeah, so I got to watch Peter Falk up close, and John Voight and Jenna Rollins for 6 months.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was an extraordinary experience in my life, early in my life. And Peter Falk, you're right. That's exactly how he and Cassavetes would work things out, beat for beat, beat for beat. But I'll tell you something, John Cassavetes couldn't stomach when things got set. So everything was always in flux. There was never anything that got set.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so the night that we opened, when he couldn't change anything anymore, he disappeared. We never saw him again. Because he couldn't change it again, and he would just change and change and change. He couldn't deal with anything being in stasis. He wanted it all to be in sort of a chaotic state, and people thrived under it. It was very interesting. I've never been through anything else like that before. Did you find when you worked with Peter Falk that he was very exacting to the point where he wanted it just so? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's the way he was. Yes.
And I think it was that way too, but somehow he tolerated Cassavetes. Isn't that interesting?
It is interesting, especially from, at least in my experience, when he was planning out every single move he was doing, not when the cameras were rolling, when they were lighting. He would walk through it a couple of times and then talk himself through all the things he wanted to do.
Absolutely.
So that really, thank you for this fascinating Cassavetes story. I had not heard this before.
Yeah. That was 1981 that happened. So that's a long time ago. That's 36 years ago.
Well, that was around the same time I knew you.
That's right. I worked with you not too long after that, but I had done the Cassavetes shows before ever meeting you. And of course, I don't know if you realize, but I went to school with Kelly Ward and Madeline Smith. We all were at USC at the same time.
That I did not know.
Yes, we were all there at the same time. I know Kelly and Madeline quite well. I knew them from school.
Both wonderful people, my God, and wonderful performers.
Oh, yeah.
Madeline Smith, I was so besmitten with her when the Odyssey asked me to direct a summit conference, which was really a fascinating tale, a sort of a fantasy where Ava Braun and Clara, who was Mussolini's mistress,
Right.
meet while the men are having a meet upstairs somewhere in Germany.
Correct.
And she's extremely overwhelming because she's this glamorous Italian, almost movie star, and Ava Braun was depicted as sort of a housefrau, a sort of plain, not very intellectual, not very showy person. And Madeline Smith, I had seen her do a Moliere play downtown at the Mark Taper Forum,
Right.
and I so fell in love with her that when they offered me this play, I said, I can't do it unless I can get this woman, Madeline Smith, to play the Italian part,
Wow.
the Mussolini girlfriend part.
Wow.
And I did all kinds of machinations with her agents at CAA. Finally, I managed to have a drink with her, and I handed her the script, and I said, you were born to play this, and I ain't doing this unless you're going to do it. And I talked her into doing it, and I was thrilled.
Well,
she exceeded every expectation.
That was a really wonderful show that, I think, if I remember right, we got terrific reviews. And
We did, yes.
And played in rep with Hess, which was a one-man show with Orson Bean.
Right, and then Allie Mills and Orson Bean got together, got married.
And got married. Yeah.
Yes, they've been married all this time.
I mean, that's just an awesome thing that happens when that goes on. So let's go back to process too, because I think it's interesting. When we did that show, did you have a certain technique, or was there something that you used as a director that helped the actors to get through?
No, it's interesting. What I had to do was try to find a way to bridge two very different acting styles. Allie Mills had one style and Madeline had another.
Right.
And though they got along very, very well, their acting process was totally different. Allie had to rethink everything. If there was a change, she really had to... It was a mental process that she would go through to accommodate the change that we were being asked to do, or I was asking them to do. And Madeline was just... I can't even describe how really effortless her acting is.
Oh, she's a natural. She's naturally gifted.
She's just natural, and it's easy, it's facile, and yet she has great depth with what she does.
Mm-hmm.
But the exterior, the style, the grace, all that is natural to her, and yet she's able to render it with such realistic accuracy, and Allie is very opposite. She has to intuit it mentally. She has to process it. She has to figure it out. She has to see if one thing you ask her conflicts with her other opinion of where she should be.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very, very, very different. And the result was spectacular because their styles were so different, but then so were their characters.
Well, that's right. And so when it worked, it worked. It was great fireworks between them, which was great.
Yes, because here was this grounded sort of housefrau, and then there was this glittering sort of movie star in Madeline Smith, who was overwhelming, and Ava Braun had to hold her ground. She needed almost cement booties to keep herself from engaging in flights of fantasy, just to stay at the same level that Madeline was at. Madeline's character, actually, not Madeline.
I assume you know Madeline. Talk about facile. She's her gifts include not just drama, but she's a great comedian, and she also
was great in this. She hit the comedy,
and she can do and she can sing and dance. She's a musical theater performer too, so she has great range.
She was in a production of Moliere's Misanthrope with Renee Auberjonois, who's certainly one of the great American style actors known. And I'm telling you, she not only held her own, she was astonishingly
Oh, sure.
good.
I believe it. I didn't see that.
And she was so much younger and less experienced than Renee, and yet she certainly gave him as good as she got. Well,
she in the movies, she certainly held her own against Travolta. She held her own against Steve Martin, Roy Scheider, and lots of others. So, I mean, yeah.
Also brilliant. She's a brilliant woman. She's very smart.
Yes, indeed.
And very intuitive at the same time. It's a lovely combination.
And, Kelly's been a very, very... Not only did he do Grease and The Big Red One, but he has been a very successful writer and director of animation for all these years, too.
I know that because a couple of years later, we did the casting for a couple of Universal animation series through Kelly. I guess Kelly, I had started casting voiceovers around the same time that I was doing the directing of Summit Conference. And then 2 or 3 years later, he called me and said, "Would you be interested in casting? We should have a meeting. I'd love for you to come to Universal and do some casting for us."
Right. Well, that's he both has had a great success as both a writer and a producer, and also as a voice director. So he's done all the above as well. So that's one of the things about the business, and I'm sure you'll back me up on this. Is you're a perfect example of it. You have to be versatile and be willing to do different things in order to maintain a career over a long time.
That's right. And the thing is that it's very, very hard right now. I was lucky to have been able to make a living as an actor, but these days it's very, very, very tough.
Yes, I'm sure it is.
For actors to have like a regular family or regular life outside of that, because it's you don't get, for some reason, salaries have stagnated. When I first came to town, the big crime shows, what was called top of the show, was $7,500 a week.
Right.
That was 49 years ago.
Right.
It's less today than it was then.
Wow. That's amazing.
I think Quinn Martin, which was one of the producers, they were the best paying outfit in town in 1969 when I came to town. And I will tell you that salaries, the top of the show salaries, are less than that now, or maybe they equal it.
That's unbelievable.
49 years later.
That's both unbelievable and terribly sad. It
is terribly sad. Now the other thing is that though the day rate has gone up for the actor, the day rate, the minimum day rate that the studios can pay, has changed over the years and really gone up many times. I think I originally was being paid like $140 a day.
Mm-hmm. It's much higher than that now, though.
It's much higher than that, yeah. Yes.
So
probably $900.
So I'm curious. When you started out, the business was a good deal smaller, I would assume. That things have grown.
It was much, much smaller. It was also very much, at least the television industry, was concentrated in Los Angeles.
Now it's all spread out.
Now it's spread out all over the place, with New York, I think, having as many shows as Los Angeles does.
Interesting. I am curious. I want to talk about some of the other movies you've done. We talked a bit about Young Frankenstein. I'm curious about what your experience with Robert Altman was like on MASH.
Well, mine was different than anybody else's. Altman was such an interesting man and almost diabolical in a way.
How's that?
Well, you would have a small little moment in the film, and at the dailies, he would say that's the best thing in the film, or that's what this film is about, or this moment is it. And the next day, he wouldn't look at you. It was just odd.
Huh.
It was an odd kind of manipulative thing that was going on, which I don't know why, but it just made me nervous. But everybody else was like hugely a huge fan of him. And yes, he was brilliant. And what he did in that film was just genius.
Right.
Instead of playing by the usual studio rules, guys like myself who had one or two lines in the written script had much more to do. And what he did was he hired all these improv actors from New York, Chicago, and San Francisco to play very small parts, but then you would be on screen as part of the ensemble.
Mm-hmm.
So that instead of hiring extras that may or may not show up the next day, we were essentially speaking extras, and he gave us words and gave us things and said, you know, now would be a good time for you to do this. What he would do was he would look at the structure of the scene and change it while we were in rehearsal,
Really?
And then he would shoot it. It's brilliant. It was a brilliant, brilliant system.
Did it?
But he was.
Did it throw you off and keep you just absolutely natural? Because
no. The whole feeling was improvisational. They didn't mind if you talked over somebody else. If he gave you a little line or a little moment, he wanted that to be very clean. He was a meticulous director in a way, in that he was hoping all the time for some great improvisation that was going to take over the scene. He was brilliant at what he did, an amazing man.
Well,
but he did have this peculiar sort of affect around the set that was different, and oddly, I thought unsettling. For example, I always thought that he seemed not to like Donald Sutherland for some reason.
Huh.
And I always thought that, I forgot the third guy. I just thought of his name. Was the lead because he kept praising him.
Elliot Gould?
No, not Elliot. It was a third person, and I'll remember.
Robert Duvall?
No. He was the third listed. He's a really wonderful character actor, and Altman would praise him all the time and almost never say anything complimentary about Don Sutherland. So I assumed that when I went to see the finished product, that Sutherland's part would be diminished. It wasn't so.
No.
It's odd, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, yeah. And he just, I guess
Tom
Skerritt.
He was Tom Skerritt. Tom Skerritt, I thought, was going to be the star of the movie because Altman praised him and was constantly giving him accolades for things he did, and almost never, ever said anything about what Donald Sutherland was doing. He had a better relationship with Elliot Gould.
Well, maybe there was a purpose to a method to his madness, where
exactly.
by keeping him at bay.
There was some purpose to it.
Mm-hmm.
That's my point. I just couldn't divine what it was, so it was mysterious. This behavior was mysterious to me.
Probably to keep him, put off in some way, to make him have that kind of edge to his performance.
I guess it certainly worked.
Yeah, no,
Sutherland's great in the movie.
It's a brilliant movie, and obviously then spawned an even greatly brilliant show, a TV show, for all those years. But certainly the movie, I remember when I saw it, it just blew my mind. It was so unusual.
Yeah, it really was. It broke so many rules that Hollywood held dear. For example, that you had to hear every single word of dialogue, which incidentally no longer exists. I watch television shows now, and I'm thinking, they never mic'd this guy? They never checked sound levels?
Oh, that drives me crazy.
Why is it so shoddy?
Yeah, it drives me crazy when you can't understand what the actors are saying to each other.
Absolutely.
I think, is there something
wrong
with me?
Working in TV, if you not flub the line, but if it was not clear, they would have you come in and do ADR a week later to make sure your enunciation was so perfect.
Not anymore.
That's how diligent they were, but it no longer exists because the style has changed. So on a lot of the HBO shows, people are mumbling constantly, and you barely can understand what they're saying.
I frequently think there's something wrong with my hearing, which I know there isn't. So it drives me crazy when I think, I don't understand what they're saying.
I have a friend that keeps everything on closed caption, and he's considerably younger than I am, and his hearing is a lot better than mine. But he says it drives him crazy, so he just watches.
Yeah.
He uses it to make the script clear.
I don't see the purpose of it. If the audience doesn't understand what people are doing or saying, then why are you even telling the story?
Well, yeah, that was the old thought, but not anymore.
So let's talk about Arthur Penn, who I think is maybe one of the greatest directors of all time. And working with him on the Missouri Breaks, what was that like?
Well, what happened was they had hired an actor studio guy, I forgot his name for the moment, to play this little part. And a guy I knew from the O'Neill Foundation recommended me to Arthur Penn because this guy had, I think, fear of heights, and they wanted to show him on this bridge, on this railway bridge, and he was terrified of heights and said he couldn't do it. So they reshot me in that part.
Interesting.
I was hired because I was an improviser, and they didn't have they had a couple of lines, but they didn't really have a written scene.
And they let you go.
So
they let you riff.
What's that?
They let you riff on things.
And it was with Jack Nicholson, which was, I thought, oh my God, this is too great.
That is too great. Was he easy to work with?
Oh my God. First of all, Missouri Breaks, that was the movie with also
Brando.
Had Marlon Brando,
yeah.
Who I didn't get to work with, but there were stories about him on the set were just incredible. Anyway, what had happened was I was in rehearsal for a play with Milton Berle. I had one day off to fly to Montana and shoot this one scene. I had done, previous to that, I had done some work on the scene without dialogue of me recoupling and being on this platform, being on this bridge in the scene. And then they shot the dialogue part. Except the problem was there was a plane delay. I had to catch a plane out of LAX that was going to go to Salt Lake City and then take me up to Missoula, Montana, or wherever it was.
Right.
Maybe I think it was Missoula. Anyway, the plane I was on never made its connection. I ended up in Idaho Falls, and I had to be at an 8 o'clock shooting the next morning, and I drove from Idaho Falls all the way across Montana. I found the car dealership, the car rental person had left and was in the parking lot, and I made her go and give me a car.
And drove all the way across Montana?
And I drove all the way through. Now, they didn't expect me. So at 8 o'clock, I show up in town, and I say, I'm here to report to duty. And they said, well, your plane never made it. All the technicians were on that plane. They had to stay over in Salt Lake City.
Oh, wow.
I said, well, I'm sorry, I made it. And so they called Jack Nicholson, and he came over. It's about an hour and a half. Came over and said, I've been driving all night. And then we improvised this little scene together.
And was he a good improviser with you?
Oh my God! Not only that, was he so supportive. He would say to Arthur Penn, "Did you hear what he did? I like that. Let's do it. If he does it again, let's keep it."
And what did you get from Arthur Penn that was obviously going to be different than a Robert Altman or a Mel Brooks? What did he do that was different?
I think he just allowed me to do what I was doing, and he figured he was going to cut it the way he wanted to cut it anyway. But we did it a couple of times, rehearsed a couple of times, and then things would come up in improv, and he liked it and was very supportive.
So,
Basically, gave me positions to stand and where he wanted me to end up and stuff like that.
mm-hmm. I'm curious, and with all the directors you've worked with, and you've also been a director yourself, obviously, what would you say is the best piece of directorial advice anybody's ever given you, as from a director to an actor?
Well, I'm not sure that this was a compliment. I did a show called A Mother's Kisses, which at that time was the biggest flop on before Broadway.
Great.
Closed out of town.
Great.
With B. Arthur and her husband.
Gene Saks.
Gene Saks was directing.
Sure.
And I had a little scene that actually got me a big agent and a lot of notice. I had one little scene at the beginning of the show, and we kept getting laughs, so they kept adding to it. And the show was in trouble anyway, but they were very nice to me in that they kept building up this little part I had. Anyway, what Gene said to me one time, and I think he in some ways complimented me, and in another way, I didn't quite know how to handle it. He said, you realize you act like a director. I said, is this a good thing or a bad thing? He said, well, think about it. I've never had to tell you anything to do, did I? I said, no. I said, but there's got to be a downside to this. But he didn't specify. Years later, I was taking an acting class with an actress and director by the name of Joan Darling.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my friends were in it. Bud Cort was in that acting class. I think Jeannie Berlin was in it.
Right.
There was a bunch of people, young people, were in her class. And one day, she said to us, if you guys have been working in the business for a while, if you've never been fired as an actor, you're probably not very good. Well, I was completely fucked up over this. I was completely messed up because I thought, oh my God, I've never been fired.
Did you go out and try to get yourself fired?
Good.
Did you go out and try to
What?
Did you go out and try to get yourself fired?
No, I totally forgot about a whole other incident, and now I'm working on a show called Beretta.
Right.
Now, curiously enough, that was Robert Blake.
Robert Blake, yeah.
Oh, I now see 3 times a week because we are in cardiac rehab together.
No, really?
Yes. Anyway, so I see Bob Blake 3 times, Robert Blake 3 times a week. Anyway, I'm working on the set of that, and I ran into this actor. His name was John Marley.
Right.
And he was the guy in The Godfather
With the horse.
who gets a horse in his bed.
Yeah.
Anyway, Marley was there, and he came up to me and he said, "Oh, Danny Goldman, I am so happy to see you." I said, "Why? Why am I so happy? Why are you so happy?" He said, "I fired you from a production of Galileo in Baltimore. I didn't exactly fire you. I reduced you, and it was a big mistake, and I felt so terrible, and I just never got over it, that I thought I had made a mistake. You had been doing a good enough job, but I wanted somebody older to play it, and it just didn't work out so well for me. And I really always wanted to apologize to you, so I'm happy and grateful." And I said, I can't believe it. I can't believe
You
it.
got fired.
He said, "Why are you so happy?" And then I told the story about Joan Darling saying that if you've never been fired, you can't be very good.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you got fired in your career, Danny.
Isn't that funny? I had totally forgotten about it.
So, all right, let's talk about something a little different than live action, which is
Animation.
Animation. Right? You have been the voice of Brainy Smurf for what? Close to 40 years?
It was 9 years. No, it was 9 years of actual recording.
Right.
For 9 years.
But
the
Smurfs have been around forever.
Story. I wasn't hired to play Brainy Smurf at all. I kept auditioning for it, and I never got it. And one day my agents called me. I was sick as a dog, and he said, "You have to go to Hanna-Barbera. They want to see you one more time." I thought, this is ridiculous. I've been on tape for them 6 times auditioning for this part. This is ridiculous. I mean, can't they just go to the tape? Anyway, I reluctantly went there, and then they gave me the part. What I didn't know, I was not in the pilot. I don't know if they ever restored my voice. I don't know. I never watched myself, so I've never seen a lot of work I've done.
Right.
So I show up there, and it's a room full of people, and I had been casting voiceover now for about 2 or 3 years, and it's all these voiceover geniuses like Paul Winchell, Michael Bell, June Foray. I mean, it was an incredible array of voiceover stars. This is before famous people took over voiceover jobs.
Right. Was Dawes Butler in that?
It was the most intimidating room I'd ever been in, and I managed to get through it, and then they hired me. Oh, they kept saying, "Well, can you come in on Tuesday?" They never actually hired me. They just kept giving me other appointments. And then I guess then I finally solidified my hold on it. The original guy they hired was Steve Franken. Do you know who he is?
Steve Franken.
Steve Franken was brilliant in a little film called The Party, and I think he was on one of those.
Yes.
It may have been.
Was he the drunk? Was he the drunken
Gilligan's
waiter?
Island, maybe.
Was he the drunk? Was he the drunken waiter in The Party?
Yes.
Oh, brilliant.
He was brilliant in it, and he was also in, I think, Gilligan's Island, one of those early '60s, late '50s sitcoms.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, they had offered to him, and remember, I guess on the show that he was on, he sounded very much like William Buckley.
Yes.
It was very East Coast, sort of mid-Atlantic almost accent of high culture,
right.
And that was the Brainy that he brought to it. It would never have occurred to me since that wasn't my shtick. So my Brainy was something else. Was much more human and very fallible and very, very flawed character. And it turned out to be a cuter version than somebody playing like a William Buckley in that part.
A warmer character.
A warmer, very human, very fallible. And on that, the writers went crazy, so they wrote Brainy. Really, it was just great because they wrote him into almost every episode. I mean, I was all over the place because there was someone they'd go to. Everybody else was so goody two-shoes. All the Smurfs were so goody two-shoes. And I was so deeply flawed.
Yes.
The writers loved writing him.
Well, you were the character that we, in a way you love to hate because, or not hate's the wrong word, but love to,
exactly.
to feel.
No, that was, yeah.
You'd feel sorry for him at the same time because he was so smart but so arrogant about it.
Right. Yes, he had a little bit of megalomania.
Yes, megalomania is exactly right. Okay, so what for you as an actor are there differences between how you would approach a voiceover role versus a live action part? Would you think about it differently in a way?
I think what happens is you feel it in your body.
In what way?
You start to feel the character. For me, since I was really new to animation, and believe me, I was the least experienced person in the room, I think I had done maybe one radio commercial in my life, although people liked my voice, and they used to always ask for me, but I never could get a decent job. And with the Smurfs, I did. And I guess I start to feel the character in my body for some reason, in the same way that you would for even though I wasn't on camera, that you would for a. Now I worked with Mel Blanc once, and Mel just sat in a chair with a cigarette, of all things, dangling out of his mouth as he did his recording.
Really?
There was no physical manifestation. It all came from his voice. It wasn't.
And you felt like you needed to use your body in order to the voice.
I needed to stand. I wasn't comfortable sitting next to somebody or being mic'd sitting down. I didn't like it. I liked standing.
Huh. And would you use your voice differently than would you?
I think so. I think that how I figured out my body, how I placed my body, affected my voice. I saw Mel Blanc. Nothing affected his voice. He did all these characters with a cigarette in his mouth.
That's amazing. I had the privilege one time at USC to see him come in and do a lecture before, I don't know, must have been 1,000 people in Bovard Auditorium. And the thing that blew my mind about Mel Blanc was he not only did all the character voices, but he was doing a lot of the sound effects. He was doing like the Wile E. Coyote going over the edge of the cliff and then dropping with the whistle and the explosion at the bottom. He was doing all that.
Nothing he did would surprise me. He was just so amazing.
Astonishing. And so did you didn't need to, other than reading the writing that was done, you didn't need to do anything special to get into a brainy headspace, did you?
No, I think I would just show up and it would be there for me. But I do know that I had to embody it. I had to hold it in my body differently than I had done on other voice projects.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever been recognized just from your voice?
For a while, yes, but I don't think my voice has changed. So I don't know that I am. I actually don't know that.
But for a while there, people might actually in a store or a restaurant or something would say, "Why do I know your voice?" or something like that. Yeah.
Yes, sometimes I would. Yes, I would sometimes get that. Yes, definitely. But they also speeded it up, so it was a little higher than I normally am.
Oh, I see. That's interesting. They sped it up a little bit.
Yeah, they did speed it up, so that changed it a little bit too.
Got it. So let's talk for just a moment or two about the business that you were in as well, the commercial casting business. And so that actors who are out there that are looking for some kind of employment, let's see if we can give them an advantage or two. What advice would you give to actors when they're auditioning for commercials? What is it that they do that gets them the work, and what is it they do that keeps them from getting the work?
Well, sometimes actors would come in and they would ask questions of the director, let's say at a callback.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a good idea because, truthfully, commercial is in flux a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So there's not necessarily a real way of, or the only way to do something. They're constantly revising their own idea of what this commercial is. So when people would ask questions of the director, it forced the director to commit to a vision he wasn't ready yet to have.
Got it.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Sure. In other words, you're forcing his hand.
Meeting the ad agency maybe for the first time at the callback, because all they did was exchange things like the director's reel, or his rep would talk to the ad agency, but they had only a little communication before, and when they actually met in person sometimes, it was startling. And so an actor coming in and asking a bunch of questions in front of the agency and the director, it was very confronting for the director to have to actually explain what it was that his vision was. So in general, unless a lot of people thought they were being smart by asking questions, but it actually often didn't work for them at all.
So they're kind of expecting an actor to come in and just do their bit and not ask questions and not be a problem, but to just do whatever they do naturally in terms of the part.
That's right. And there's a certain thing that would happen too. In my choice of actors, sometimes I think, gee, Steve is really such a good actor, but there are other wonderful actors too. Steve can be a problem for a director. He's very contentious, and this director I'm working for is basically the nicest guy in the world and likes to have a very happy set and not a contentious one.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'll save Steve from this kind of audition.
Wow. So you, I assume over time you got to know certain actors very well.
What they were like, how they were on set. Often we would try to follow up to find out how somebody behaved on set so that we had some sort of indication, because there is a certain amount of, one of the last directors that I worked for was Jason Reitman. You know who he is?
Of course. Ivan Reitman's son. He made Up in the Air.
Yes, and quite a wonderful filmmaker in his own right. And I knew him. I somehow got to me, and he was at USC, and he was doing all these student films. Somehow I think I cast a couple, and then he started to direct commercials, and for some reason we started working with him. And then he would say, while I'm shooting this commercial, I have a little short film, and I will probably have the set. So if you could give me some suggestions and send me some auditions of people I might want to have in this little 5-minute film I'm putting together. He was very ambitious and very wonderful to the actors, so respectful. And for a Hollywood kid whose father was famous, he showed none of the entitlement that you would expect. He was a very humble guy who really enjoyed the process and loved working with the actors.
Well, so you're saying he was very down to earth and not arrogant, which is something that happens.
Very down to earth. Very down to earth. Now, I haven't seen him lately, but when we worked with him, and I worked with him maybe 7 or 8 years, 6 or 7 years, he was a thrill to work with. He was our favorite at that time.
That's great. That's great to hear. Sometimes people who are of the industry, like Jason Reitman, know better than to act that way. And then sometimes I think that people who do act arrogant or pompous or whatever it would be, I think a lot of it has to do with insecurity.
I think that's true. Jason had a real command of what he had to offer, and he understood it. So in that case, yes, I don't think he felt the need to show off or to pull rank or to do anything like that.
Right. Well, that's, and he probably learned that from his father. I've always thought that my impression is that his father was the same way, and that he was not a pompous, arrogant person. But that's just through reputation. I don't know him, obviously.
I don't know. I've never met the father.
Right. So we're sort of heading toward the end of the show, and I'm going to ask you the two famous questions that I like to ask folks about the business. In your experience, which is quite deep, do you have a story or two that's kind of oddball or quirky or offbeat or something weird or funny that you could share with the audience?
Well, I can tell you, I shot an improvised film with O.J. Simpson. So we worked together for about 8 weeks while we were improvising and then shooting this particular film. And it was a film about group therapy, a bunch of people in group therapy. We had a real therapist. We improvised for weeks at a time until they came up with something like a script, and it was shot by this man, Lee Garms, who I think was a cinematographer on Gone with the Wind.
Oh, wow.
And it was a very interesting experiment. It was a tape-to-film experiment, so it was lit differently than they had would have lit a film.
Right.
The other thing was that the experience of O.J., he was a star and a football star at that time. He was with the Buffalo Bills and was a huge star in a way that I'd never worked with anybody that had that kind of stardom. He actually took me to a game at Dodger Stadium. He knew I was a baseball fan and said, did I want to meet Willie Mays?
Oh, wow.
I had a little apartment on near La Brea, and I look out the window, and there's a limousine, and there's O.J. and his friend Al Cowling.
Yes.
And I'm sitting between them in the back seat of this limo, and we go to Dodger Stadium, and I had never seen anything like this before. The fans all lined up for O.J.'s signature.
Wow.
He denied no one a signature.
Wow.
I don't think he saw 2 seconds of the game. There was snaky lines all over the stadium just to get to O.J. That's how big a star he was. And when we were rehearsing, which was at the Hollywood, what's now the Hollywood Renaissance, I forgot what it was called then, women in the lobby when we come down for lunch would be flinging their phone numbers at him.
Oh, gosh.
I'd never worked with such a big star on that level before. And the only other thing that I'd ever seen, I worked on a lot, and actually worked on Happy Days once, and Fonzie, in the middle of the Fonzie madness, people were snaked outside Paramount Studios for a look at
Henry Winkler.
Mr. Winkler.
Yeah.
And he was at 25 or 26 so incredibly gracious. I don't know how anybody could have stood the kind of fame that he had without them cracking. I mean, it was extraordinary at that time.
He's allegedly one of the nicest guys in the business.
He is. I actually did some casting for him later on in life. And he was a lovely guy, absolutely lovely guy. I think I shot the 5th episode of Happy Days, and it hadn't opened yet. It hadn't started.
Huh.
So I didn't know it was going to be this big deal. It was just another acting job to me. And I had known Henry Winkler a little bit. I think he had gotten my phone number. A lot of people would call you from New York when they were moving out here to, get your advice or ask you questions about life in California. I think he once called me.
And gave him a piece of advice?
Or whatever, or whatever. I think we met once or twice.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, I met him on the set on that show, and he wasn't the Fonz yet. It hadn't hit because the show hadn't aired yet. I think it was the 5th episode.
And obviously it turned into a huge success.
Yeah, later on I was working on this show called Busting Loose, and he was on the lot, and I would marvel at how well he handled fame. He's a remarkable man.
I think that's an important lesson for people to understand, that fame actually changes people in certain ways unless they work at not letting it change them.
For some reason, I don't know how he had his head screwed on with the kind of fever that he had sent through the population. It was like rock star fever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
How did he manage? I just marvel at how he managed to stay sane with all that publicity and all. I mean, it was a phenomenon.
And we've certainly seen over the history of Hollywood and the entertainment industry that some people don't handle it very well.
Absolutely.
And so
that is so true.
When they do handle it well, it is a marvelous thing to see, and I think it's worth noting that not everybody becomes famous, and when people do become famous, sometimes they go off the rails a little bit, and so I think you're right. If he's able to handle that crush of fame so graciously, that's a very positive thing to experience.
Now, everything has changed. There were 3 networks at that time, so there was only so much television being produced. Now that kind of stardom doesn't exist anymore.
Right. With rarity, there's the rare few that sneak through now and become huge. One of the things I certainly notice, I assume you probably have the same experience I do, used to be you knew who most of the big famous people were, and now I see people that crop up sometimes and I go, I don't know who this person is, but they're talking about them like they're huge, but I don't know
Exactly.
I don't know who they are, and I don't think it's because I'm older. I think it's just there are too many of them.
And you go to Google, and then you find out, oh my God, this guy's been working for years. I just never saw it.
Right.
I just happened. There's so much product out there. It's impossible to
keep up.
I'm an Emmy voter, and it's extraordinary the amount of Emmy submissions you get because there's so much television that's produced. So a Fonzie is not likely to hit in the same way as a 3-network television audience.
Oh, for sure.
Had the exact same points of reference. For example, I host a poker game at my house, and it used to be we would discuss TV shows all the time or movies we had seen. But now, because there's such a proliferation, this guy is binging on something at Netflix, another guy's binging on an Amazon show that he's all just, it's the greatest thing that he wants us all to see. And it isn't that water cooler talk anymore. Everybody's got their own thing.
Mm-hmm. It's fractured. It's totally fractured.
Totally fractured the audience. So that a Fonzie probably is not likely to happen again in our lifetime.
Isn't that interesting? And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's certainly not likely not to happen again. I think you're right.
Right.
So Danny, do you have one solid piece of advice or a tip, or even more than one if you have it, that for people attempting to have success in the business that would help them to find their way?
Well, in New York, you had a community, and of people you'd run into, and they would give you tips, and they'd say, so you were trying to get, in those days, theater and occasional television job. Here, there isn't a community in Los Angeles so much. It's a lot of subcultures at the same time. There are actors that join theater companies, but Equity has had a whole different turnaround about the kinds of shows we were doing for years.
Right.
Like the one I met you on.
The Equity Waiver.
They don't. There's a whole new Equity thing where they've tried to quash the number of productions that are done where actors are not being paid or paid by a certain kind of standard that they want. And it has changed the culture in Los Angeles, because you used to belong to a group or you would work at different theaters, and that became your community. And that may be changing.
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing is that you're constantly reinventing yourself, really, as an actor all the time. So I mean, I would think that would be the advice I would give.
Is to
You're
change?
constantly trying things. You're constantly trying to work out some of your stuff.
So your advice is to constantly be willing to go down new paths?
Yes, and improvisation is probably the best thing. I mean, it just keeps you fresh. It keeps you alert. It makes you stay in the moment more than get lost in your head. It keeps you spontaneous. So of all things, I would say, yes, among training, improvisation is a great way to go.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. Well, that's very useful information, because I think a lot of actors don't even think about improvisation unless it's forced upon them. But you're saying that that's what they should head for.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when you think of all the great people that have come out of the improv companies of Second City and the Groundlings here in L.A.,
Right.
And they end up on Saturday Night Live and become big stars, I think a lot of it is that they work so hard on the improvisation. And they, some of the schools force you to write your material. So you're writing for your characters, the characters you want to play, and you're developing characters all the time. So it's an amazing process.
Well, I think that's very wise advice. I agree that the more that you expand your horizons, and the more that you're willing to try new things and to do things that put you out on that edge, like improv, I think the more likely it is that you will continue to grow and get better at your craft.
I think so. I think it's the only way.
Well, Danny, this has been a real treat for me to have you on the show. I'm so glad you were able to spend an hour or so with me today.
I so enjoyed myself.
Well, I'm glad, and I look forward to hearing the reactions that people have off of listening to what you have to say. So much wise advice and so many great experiences. So I thank you profoundly for being on the show.
And I'm thrilled that we're back in contact.
Absolutely. All right, well, you have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Today's StoryBeat tip: know the difference between drama and melodrama. One of my favorite film directors, Sidney Lumet, wrote in his inspiring book, Making Movies, quote, "In drama, the characters should determine the story. In melodrama, the story determines the characters," closed quote. He's so right. Stories tend to play best when the characters drive the action, not when the action drives the characters. There's nothing wrong with melodrama per se, but melodrama usually plays more on the surface than well-written drama does. Melodrama tends to be more about plot. Many great thrillers and action movies are melodramatic. Such movies can be truly entertaining, wildly popular, and make a lot of money. Successful melodramatic stories keep Hollywood going. The key to success in most memorable melodrama is in the story having a single character, a hero that we care about, who goes on a quest to achieve a powerful goal. Without such a hero, you would find movies with 2 hours of car chases that only a racing enthusiast would care about. Stories work best when a protagonist makes things happen because of his or her desire to achieve a powerful objective. Think of exciting, memorable melodramas like Star Wars, The French Connection, Die Hard, and every James Bond movie ever made. But also think of the power of such unforgettable, character-driven dramas as Casablanca, Chinatown, Thelma and Louise, and The Godfather. You must understand what kind of movie you want to write in order to write the best, most moving script possible. If you write an action-heavy thriller, try to avoid letting the action dictate the plot. Instead, work hard to ensure that the protagonist's goal motivates his or her actions. That is what ought to drive the story. And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a comment on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great episodes to you. This podcast would not have been possible without the generous support of the Center for Media Innovation on the campus of Point Park University. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.